I will never touch you. My biology does not dictate my actions. He swore, his voice ice-cold and absolute. But trap a desperate Omega hiding a preheat and a fiercely disciplined Alpha CEO inside a broken elevator during a citywide blackout, and suddenly unbreakable promises shatter like fragile glass. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Hayes Innovations, turning the sprawling metropolis into a blurred watercolor of neon and gray. Anthony Hayes stood by the glass, his broad shoulders tense under his perfectly tailored Italian suit. As an alpha, Anthony was a terrifying force in the tech industry, ruthless, hyper-focused, and notoriously immune to the pheromone-driven politics that ruined lesser men. He despised the inherent weakness of secondary genders. In his world, logic reigned supreme. Callum Reed, his executive assistant for the past 3 years, watched him from the doorway, a tablet clutched tightly to his chest. Callum was a beta. At least that was what his forged medical records, his daily handful of illegal military-grade suppressants, and his meticulously crafted persona claimed. Mr. Hayes, the Gallagher merger documents are finalized. Legal just sent up the hard copies for your signature. Callum said, his voice even and professional. Anthony turned his piercing blue eyes, scanning Callum with an intensity that always made the younger man's pulse stutter. Leave them on the desk, Callum, and cancel my 8 o'clock dinner. I'm staying until this is ironclad. Callum nodded, stepping into the cavernous office. He kept his breathing shallow. For the past 48 hours, an agonizing ache had been pooling at the base of his spine. His suppressants bought off market from a shadowy contact named Reese to bypass the strict corporate pharmacy audits were failing. Or worse, the recent batch was defective. Callum couldn't afford a heat. He couldn't afford to be discovered. His younger brother Liam relied entirely on Callum's exorbitant salary for his experimental leukemia treatments. If Anthony discovered Callum was an Omega, a lying Omega, who had breached the company's strict disclosure policies, he wouldn't just be fired. He would be blacklisted. As Callum arranged the pens and smoothed out the contract, his hand brushed against Anthony's wrist. The Alpha flinched, pulling back violently as if burned. Do not mistake my reliance on your professional competence for personal familiarity. Callum Anthony had told him on his very first day, cornering him in the archives with a gaze that stripped away all defenses. I don't sleep with my staff. I don't engage in office politics. And if you are ever concerned that I might blur the lines like the rest of the alphas in this building, let me assure you, I will never touch you. That promise had been a relief back then. It was the shield Callum needed to survive in the shark tank. But tonight, the memory of those words felt like a tightening noose. Are you feeling well? Anthony's voice broke the silence, sharp and sudden. He was staring at Callum's hands, which were trembling faintly against the mahogany desk. Perfectly fine, sir. Just too much caffeine. Callum lied effortlessly, offering a polite, empty smile. Anthony stepped closer, invading Callum's personal space. The scent of rain cedar and raw power radiated off the Alpha, making Callum's knees threaten to buckle. His inner Omega, starved and suppressed for years, clawed at the walls of his mind, practically screaming to submit to bare his neck. Callum dug his fingernails into his palms until they bled, using the sharp sting of pain to anchor his fading rationality. You look pale. Go home after you file these. Anthony ordered his tone, leaving no room for argument. We have the board meeting at dawn. I need my assistant functioning, not collapsing on my floor. I can stay, Callum insisted, desperation leaking into his tone. If he went home now, he would be alone in his apartment when the heat fully broke. He needed to be here, working, distracted, surrounded by the sterile, scent-filtered air of the corporate penthouse. Furthermore, he had noticed discrepancies in the Gallagher files earlier, a subtle hidden clause that Arthur Gallagher had slipped in, intending to dilute Anthony's voting shares. Callum had to fix it before Anthony signed. "Go home, Callum. That is an order." Anthony growled, a dangerous rumble echoing in his chest. The Alpha command washed over Callum, a physical force that forced his head to bow instinctively. Panic flared in Callum's chest. The command had affected him. Betas weren't supposed to react to Alpha commands. Anthony's eyes narrowed, a flicker of confusion crossing his stoic features. Before Anthony could question the reaction, the lights overhead flickered violently. A low hum reverberated through the building, followed by a deafening clap of thunder that rattled the glass. "The storm is worsening," Anthony muttered, distracted from Callum's slip. "Get your coat. We're taking the private elevator down. I'm having my driver take you home. I won't have you catching pneumonia and leaving me stranded with the temps tomorrow." Callum's heart plummeted. The private executive elevator, a 6-by-6-foot metal box, just the two of them. With his suppressants rapidly losing their grip and a heat crash imminent, getting into a confined space with a dominant Alpha was a death sentence. I can take the stairs to the lobby, sir, or the service elevator." Callum stammered, backing away. "Don't be ridiculous. It's 70 floors down," Anthony snapped, grabbing his trench coat and briefcase. "Walk with me. Now." The executive elevator was a marvel of modern engineering, lined with brushed steel and mirrored glass. Normally, the descent to the underground parking garage took exactly 90 seconds. Callum stood as far into the corner as physically possible, pressing his back against the cold metal, praying to whatever gods were listening that his body would hold out for just 1.5 minutes. 60 floors left. Anthony stood near the doors, a towering monolith of calm scrolling through his phone. He smelled incredible. Callum squeezed his eyes shut, panting silently through his mouth. His skin felt like it was on fire, a feverish, slick heat radiating outward from his core. The scent blockers patches he wore under his collar were burning his skin, overwhelmed by the sudden spike in pheromone production. 40 floors left. Callum's legs gave out. He slid down the mirrored wall, hitting the floor with a soft thud. Anthony turned, phone dropping to his side. "Callum, what the hell?" Suddenly the elevator jerked violently. A sickening screech of metal on metal echoed down the shaft. The lights blew out with a loud pop, plunging them into absolute suffocating darkness. The hum of the ventilation system died. The emergency brakes engaged with a violent shudder that tossed Anthony against the handrail. Then silence. Total, terrifying silence. "Damn it," Anthony cursed in the dark. A second later, the weak beam of his phone flashlight cut through the blackness, sweeping over the small space until it landed on Callum. The assistant was curled into a tight ball on the floor, shaking uncontrollably, his arms wrapped around his knees. "Callum, look at me," Anthony commanded, moving closer. He knelt beside the trembling man, reaching out to check his pulse. The moment Anthony's fingers brushed the skin of Callum's neck, a shockwave ripped through the confined space. With the ventilation system dead, the air in the elevator was stagnant, trapping everything inside. Callum's scent patches had completely failed. A wave of pure, unfiltered omega pheromones exploded into the air, the intoxicating, maddening scent of crushed vanilla wild honey and deep, desperate distress. Anthony gasped physically, staggering back as if he had been punched in the chest. The phone slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor and casting long, distorted shadows across the steel walls. "What? What is this?" Anthony choked out his voice, dropping an octave, becoming gravelly and feral. His alpha instincts, dormant and tightly controlled for over a decade, roared to life with blinding, terrifying force. His pupils blew wide, swallowing the blue of his irises. "Don't!" Callum sobbed, pressing himself harder into the corner, his voice raw and wet. "Please, Mr. Hayes, stay away. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. You're an Omega." Anthony breathed the revelation, hitting him like a freight train. His meticulous, brilliant, completely unassuming beta assistant was an Omega, and not just any Omega. An Omega plunging headfirst into a brutal, unmedicated heat, locked in a metal box with him. "I couldn't... My brother... The bills..." Callum babbled deliriously, the fever fully taking over. His rational mind was melting away, replaced by the primal biological imperative to find an alpha, to seek comfort, to mate. He writhed on the floor, tearing at the restrictive collar of his dress shirt, popping the buttons in his desperation to cool his burning skin. Anthony pressed himself against the opposite wall, his hands fisted so tightly in his hair that he was ripping strands out. He was fighting a war inside his own skull. "I will never touch you." The promise echoed in his mind, a flimsy, pathetic barrier against the tsunami of instinct. The scent of vanilla and honey was a physical weight in his lungs. It tasted sweet on his tongue. His fangs ached, lengthening painfully against his bottom lip. "Callum, put your coat back on," Anthony ordered. But it wasn't a corporate command. It was a desperate, ragged plea. "It hurts, Alpha." Callum whimpered, the honorific slipping out before he could stop it. The word snapped something fundamental inside Anthony's brain. "Don't call me that," Anthony growled, though his body was already moving, inching across the floor toward the writhing Omega. "I said I wouldn't touch you. I made a rule. I don't break my rules." "Make it stop," Callum cried, dragging himself across the floor. He didn't care about the job anymore. He didn't care about the secrets or the lies. The pain was blinding, a hollow, aching emptiness in his very marrow that only the man in the room could fill. Callum's fingers brushed Anthony's polished shoe, then wrapped around the Alpha's ankle. Anthony let out a guttural sound, half sob, half roar. He dropped to his knees, his hands hovering over Callum's trembling form. The heat radiating off the Omega was staggering. "You lied to me," Anthony whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of absolute fury and overwhelming desire. He grabbed Callum's wrists, pinning them to the floor with a grip that was entirely too gentle for a furious Alpha. "Please!" Callum gasped, looking up into Anthony's darkened eyes. In the dim light of the dropped phone, Callum's face was flushed red, his eyes glazed with heat fever, his lips parted. "If I touch you now, Callum," Anthony said, leaning down until his nose brushed the scent gland hidden on Callum's neck, inhaling deeply. "There is no going back. The contract is void. My rules are dead, and I will ruin you for anyone else." "Do it," Callum breathed, tilting his head to bare his throat completely. "Break your promise." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the suspended metal cage, the real tempest had just begun. The power grid remained dead, the rescue crews were delayed by the flooded streets, and the unbreakable Alpha CEO finally surrendered to the one thing he swore he would never let control him. Darkness swallowed the elevator heavy and stagnant, broken only by the ragged, synchronized gasping of two men stripped down to their absolute biology. Anthony's hands, usually steady enough to sign billion-dollar acquisitions, without a tremor, shook violently as they gripped Callum's hips. The cold, brushed steel of the floor bit into Callum's bare shoulders, a stark contrast to the blistering, fever-like heat melting through his veins. Every breath Callum took was a physical struggle, pulling in the heavy, cedar-drenched air that tasted like raw ozone and alpha dominance. He arched his spine, the movement involuntary, driven by a primal cluster of nerves that demanded friction, demanded weight. Anthony. Callum choked out his fingers, digging into the expensive wool of Anthony's trousers, seeking purchase. Anthony clamped a hand over Callum's mouth, not to silence him, but to stop himself from leaning down and devouring the sound. Sweat dripped from Anthony's jaw, landing on Callum's collarbone with a startling wetness. The alpha was warring with his own skeletal structure, his muscles locking up in a desperate bid for restraint. "If I mark you," Anthony rasped, the vibration of his chest rumbling directly against Callum's sternum, "you don't get to walk away. You don't get to be just my assistant tomorrow. You understand the permanence of this biology, Callum. It rewrites the neural pathways. It is ownership." Callum's vision blurred. The scent of vanilla and wild honey was suffocating them both, pooling in the unventilated 6x6 space like a flammable gas. He didn't care about tomorrow. He cared about the localized agony radiating from his scent gland, a throbbing pulse that felt like a severe infection demanding to be lanced. "Mark me!" Callum whimpered against Anthony's palm. "Please, it hurts." The last thread of Anthony's ironclad control snapped with a sound inside his own head that resembled tearing canvas. He moved. His teeth elongated the sharp pressure of his fangs, dragging against the sweat-slicked skin of Callum's neck. Callum let out a muffled cry as Anthony sank his teeth directly into the swollen scent gland. The pain was sharp, immediate, and brilliantly white, slicing through the hazy fog of the heat. But a millisecond later, the pain was swallowed by a rushing, torrential flood of endorphins. The bond snapped into place, a heavy, invisible anchor dropping straight through Callum's chest, tethering his frantic nervous system to the steady, rhythmic drumming of Anthony's heart. Anthony swallowed the copper tang of blood, his jaw locked in place. As the biological transfer completed, the overwhelming scent of distressed honey smoothed out, turning into a rich, deep amber. Suddenly, a deafening screech of grinding metal shattered the heavy silence. The elevator jerked upward, throwing Anthony off balance. The emergency brakes disengaged with a violent mechanical thud. A second later, the power grid surged. The overhead fluorescent panels flickered and snapped on with a blinding, sterile white glare. Callum flinched, throwing an arm over his eyes as the sudden light pierced his dilated pupils. The ventilation fans roared to life, immediately sucking the heavy pheromone-soaked air up through the exhaust grates. "Mr. Hayes, stand back from the doors," a muffled voice shouted from the other side of the steel panels. Reality crashed down onto the cold floor. The rescue team. Anthony scrambled backward, his chest heaving, his mouth stained with a thin smear of blood. He stared at Callum, who was curled on his side, his dress shirt torn, his neck heavily bruised and bleeding sluggishly around the deep puncture wounds. The reality of what he had done, what his biology had forced him to do, hit Anthony like a physical blow. "Callum," Anthony whispered, his voice cracking. The elevator doors shuddered, then began to pry open with the screech of a hydraulic wedge. Instinct, dark and territorial, flared in Anthony. He snatched his discarded trench coat from the floor and threw it over Callum, completely burying the Omega under the heavy scent-masking fabric, just as the doors parted. 3 firefighters and David Miller, the chief of security, stood in the lobby of the 42nd floor, holding pry bars and heavy flashlights. "Sir, are you injured?" David asked, stepping forward. "Stay exactly where you are," Anthony barked his alpha command, lacing his voice so sharply that the 3 beta firefighters visibly stiffened, halting in their tracks. Anthony stood up, blocking their view of the bundle on the floor. He wiped the corner of his mouth with the back of his hand. "Clear the floor. Have my private vehicle brought to the loading dock immediately. No personnel are to be in the lower corridors." Mr. Hayes' protocol dictates, David started. I don't give a damn about protocol, David. Clear the floor, or you'll be looking for employment by dawn. 10 minutes later, wrapped in Anthony's coat and hidden from the world, Callum was loaded into the back of a black SUV. The transition from the freezing parking garage to the leather interior was a blur of exhaustion. The heat fever had broken, shattered by the bonding bite, leaving Callum hollowed out, shivering, and violently nauseous. They didn't go to Callum's cramped apartment. Anthony directed the driver to a private, heavily guarded concierge clinic on the Upper East Side. The stark white walls of the medical suite offered no comfort. Dr. Harrison Caldwell, an old colleague of Anthony's father, who specialized in secondary gender endocrinology, drew Callum's blood with silent practiced efficiency. The sting of the needle was nothing compared to the dull, throbbing ache in Callum's neck, which was now wrapped in thick white gauze. Anthony paced the length of the small room, his shoes squeaking faintly against the linoleum. He hadn't spoken since the elevator. He smelled like burnt coffee and rigid anxiety. Dr. Caldwell returned 20 minutes later, holding a digital tablet. His expression was grim. He's stable, Dr. Caldwell said, tapping the screen. The heat crash is severe, but the bonding bite regulated his nervous system before any permanent neurological damage occurred. However, Anthony, we have a massive legal and medical issue here. Anthony stopped pacing. Explain. Callum's blood work, the doctor said, turning the tablet to show a graph of sharply dipping lines. He had traces of military-grade suppressants in his system. Highly illegal but effective. However, the most recent dosage in his bloodstream wasn't just degraded, it was laced with a synthetic catalyst, a chemical designed to aggressively strip the suppressants from the receptors and force an immediate, violent heat. Callum weakly pushed himself up on his elbows, the paper on the examination table crinkling loudly. That's impossible. Reese, the guy I buy them from, he's been reliable for 3 years. Someone paid your guy off, Callum, Anthony said, his voice dropping into a deadly quiet register. He looked at the doctor. Can you isolate the chemical signature? Prove it was administered intentionally. Yes, it's a patented compound, usually used in livestock breeding. Very traceable, Dr. Caldwell confirmed. Anthony turned to Callum, his blue eyes cold and calculating. Arthur Gallagher. Callum blinked, his sluggish brain struggling to catch up. The merger. I found a hidden clause in his paperwork before the storm. A dilution of your voting shares. Gallagher knew the clause wouldn't hold up to my scrutiny. Anthony deduced the pieces snapping together. He needed me distracted. He needed a scandal. He dug into my staff, found out my beta assistant was buying black market suppressants, and weaponized your biology to compromise me during the final 72 hours of the merger window. Anthony walked over to the examination table, stopping inches from Callum. He didn't touch him, maintaining that ironclad boundary despite the newly formed bond, screaming at him to provide physical comfort. He intended for you to go into heat in the office, for me to lose control in front of the board, or for the resulting HR disaster to force my resignation, Anthony stated. He underestimated my preference for the private elevator. Callum looked down at his trembling hands. I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes. I'll draft my resignation immediately. I'll sign whatever NDAs your legal team requires. Just, please don't let this affect Liam's insurance coverage. Anthony's jaw clenched. Do not be absurd, Callum. My brother has leukemia. Callum whispered the exhaustion, finally stripping away his professional armor. The suppressants, the lies, the corporate policy against omegas in executive suites. I needed the salary. If I lose this job, Liam loses his spot in the trial program. The silence in the clinic room stretched thick and heavy. The air conditioning hummed a low mechanical drone that vibrated against the floorboards. Anthony finally reached out. He didn't offer a gentle caress. He grasped the back of Callum's neck, his large hand wrapping around the bandages, a firm, heavy weight that instantly sent a wave of calming alpha pheromones straight into Callum's bloodstream. The shivering stopped immediately. "Arthur Gallagher thinks he has manufactured a weakness," Anthony said, his thumb brushing the edge of the gauze. "He thinks tying me to an Omega will make me soft, predictable. He fundamentally misunderstands how I operate." Anthony looked back at the doctor. "Harrison, secure the blood samples. Get the toxicology report certified by an independent lab by 5:00 a.m. "What are you going to do, Anthony?" Dr. Caldwell asked. "I am going to the board meeting," Anthony replied, turning his gaze back to Callum, "and I am going to ruin him." Dawn broke over the city in streaks of bruised purple and harsh grey. The storm had passed, leaving the streets slick and reflective. Inside the Hayes Innovations boardroom on the 70th floor, the atmosphere was sterile and tense. The long mahogany table was surrounded by 12 board members, their expensive suits rustling slightly as they shifted in their leather chairs. The smell of freshly brewed espresso did nothing to mask the sour tang of nervous sweat in the room. Arthur Gallagher sat at the far end, his posture relaxed, a faint, confident smirk playing on his lips. He checked his heavy gold watch. 6:05 a.m. "It appears our CEO is absent," Gallagher noted, his voice carrying easily across the silent room. "Given the crucial nature of this merger finalization, punctuality is—" Heavy double doors swung open, hitting the magnetic stoppers with a loud, authoritative crack. Anthony Hayes strode into the room. He wasn't wearing his usual immaculate suit. He wore a dark charcoal sweater and slacks, looking rumpled, dangerous, and decidedly feral. He bypassed his chair at the head of the table and walked directly toward Gallagher. "Arthur." Anthony said, his voice flat, devoid of any professional courtesy. He tossed a thick manila folder onto the polished wood, directly in front of the older man. "Anthony, you're late, and frankly you look awful." Gallagher chuckled, though his eyes darted nervously to the folder. "Let's review the final contracts." "There is no merger," Anthony stated, bracing his hands on the table and leaning in, "but there is a certified toxicology report, a sworn affidavit from a black market pharmaceutical distributor named Reese, and a trail of encrypted wire transfers leading directly from your offshore holding company to his accounts." The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Several board members sat up straight, the rustle of paper ceasing entirely. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Gallagher said, his voice tightening. "You bribed a dealer to lace my assistant's medical suppressants with a synthetic catalyst designed to trigger a forced biological heat." Anthony continued, his voice echoing off the glass walls. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. The raw, predatory weight of his presence pressed down on the room, suffocating the air. "Corporate espionage is a civil matter, Arthur. Tampering with medical supplies and inducing forced biological trauma is a federal felony carrying a 20-year sentence." Gallagher's face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. "You can't prove—" "The FBI is currently executing a search warrant at your primary residence in Westchester," Anthony interrupted, checking his own watch. "They breached the door 4 minutes ago." Murmurs erupted around the table. "You thought a mate bond was a vulnerability," Anthony said, quietly, strictly for Gallagher's ears. "You thought forcing my biology to override my logic would break my discipline. You forgot one thing, Arthur. I am a highly territorial alpha, and you tried to poison what is mine." Anthony stood up straight, addressing the paralyzed board. "Arthur Gallagher's shares are being seized, pending federal indictment. The merger is dead. I want his office cleared out by noon." Without waiting for a response, Anthony turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. The hospital room was quiet when Anthony returned. The afternoon sun was cutting through the blinds, casting warm geometric shadows across the linoleum. Callum was sitting up, dressed in soft cotton scrubs provided by the clinic. The heavy gauze had been replaced by a smaller, discreet bandage. He looked up from a tablet when the door clicked open. The immediate, involuntary spike of relief that flooded Callum's chest was startling the bond, reacting to the proximity of its anchor. "It's done," Anthony said, taking off his suit jacket and draping it over a plastic visitor's chair. "Gallagher is in federal custody. Liam's medical trust has been fully funded through my personal accounts, independent of the company." Callum swallowed hard, the rough fabric of the scrubs scratching against his collarbone. "Mr. Hayes, you didn't have to." "Stop calling me that," Anthony said, running a hand through his hair. He looked exhausted, the adrenaline finally leaving his system. He sat down on the edge of the stiff mattress. The springs creaked under his weight. Anthony looked at the bandage on Callum's neck. "I made a promise to you 3 years ago. I broke it." "You saved my life," Callum corrected quietly. "And you saved Liam." Anthony reached out his fingertips, brushing the skin just below the bandage. It wasn't a corporate command, nor a biological imperative. It was a choice. "The rules have changed, Callum." Anthony murmured, the scent of cedar and rain softening into something protective and deeply permanent. "But the logic remains the same. You are staying with me." Callum leaned into the touch, feeling the steady, thumping rhythm of Anthony's pulse against his skin. For the first time in his life, he didn't need to hide. "I'm not going anywhere," Callum replied. That wraps up the intense, dramatic story of Anthony and Callum, proving that even the most ironclad promises can be broken when biology and corporate espionage collide in the dark. Did you expect that twist with Gallagher's sabotage? Please let us know your favorite moment in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this grounded, suspenseful Omegaverse drama, please hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling audio stories today.